The afternoon sun cast long, lazy shadows across the bustling city streets, painting everything in a warm, golden light. On one of these busy sidewalks, a young woman named Elara walked with a gentle purpose, her arms wrapped securely around a stack of books from the library. She was a quiet soul, Elara, the kind of person who noticed the little things, a struggling flower pushing through a crack in the pavement, the tired sigh of a shopkeeper closing his stall. Her world was one of simple kindness, and it was this very nature that was about to steer her life in a direction she could never have imagined. Her route home took her past a small, charming park, a little oasis of green in the middle of all the concrete and noise. It was here that her sharp eyes caught a scene that made her steps falter and her heart beat a little faster. A little way off the main path, near a weathered wooden bench, an elderly lady stood looking flustered and frightened. She was clutching a simple, woven handbag to her chest like a shield. Surrounding her were three rough-looking men, their postures aggressive and their voices a low, threatening rumble that Elara could feel more than hear from where she stood. The lady, whose name was Mrs. Agatha, tried to step around them, but one of the men moved to block her path, a nasty grin spreading across his face. He reached out a hand, not for her, but for the bag she held so tightly. Elara's mind raced. She was just one person, small and not at all strong. Running into a fight was foolish, but walking away and leaving this kind-looking woman to these bullies was simply unthinkable. It went against everything she was. Thinking quickly, Elara ducked behind a large oak tree, her mind scrambling for a plan. She fumbled in her own bag, her fingers closing not around a phone, but around the hard, rectangular shape of her library book. It would have to do. She took a deep, shaky breath, stepped out from behind the tree, and pointed the book in the direction of the man as if it were a phone, trying to make her voice sound as loud and authoritative as possible. "I've called the police," she shouted, her voice cutting through the tense air. "They're on their way right now. They said to stay right where you are." The effect was instant. The three men, who had been so focused on their target, snapped their heads toward Elara. Their confidence flickered, replaced by a nervous uncertainty. They hadn't counted on a witness, let alone one who had already called for help. Their leader, a man with a scar above his eyebrow, glared at Elara, then back at Mrs. Agatha. With a sharp, grunted command, he jerked his head, and the three of them turned and fled, their footsteps slapping against the pavement as they disappeared around a corner. For a moment, everything was still. The only sounds were the distant traffic and Mrs. Agatha's soft, relieved breaths. Elara hurried over, her own knees feeling a little weak now that the danger had passed. "Are you all right?" Elara asked, her voice full of genuine concern as she gently touched the woman's arm. Mrs. Agatha looked up at her, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and immense gratitude. "Oh, my dear child," she breathed, her voice trembling. "You were so brave. Thank you. Thank you so much." Her belongings were scattered on the ground around the bench. Elara immediately knelt down and began to help gather them, an embroidered handkerchief, a set of keys, a small, black and white photograph of a handsome young man. She carefully handed each item back to the woman. "It's nothing, really," Elara said softly. "Anyone would have done the same." "But you are the one who did," Mrs. Agatha replied, her voice growing stronger. She looked at Elara with a keen, appreciative eye. "My name is Agatha, and I insist on repaying your kindness. Let me at least offer you a proper thank you. Please, come to my home for a cup of tea. It's the very least I can do." Elara wanted to refuse, to say it wasn't necessary, but there was such a warm, sincere insistence in the woman's eyes that she found herself nodding. "All right," she agreed. "My name is Elara." Mrs. Agatha's home was not far, a beautiful old brownstone building that seemed quiet and grand. As they walked, Mrs. Agatha chatted warmly about her garden and her love for reading, and Elara felt herself relaxing, the last of her adrenaline fading. She had no idea that the simple, kind woman whose arm was linked with hers was the mother of one of the most powerful and feared men in the city. She had no clue that her single act of courage had just drawn a line connecting her quiet world to a world of shadows and power. She had simply helped someone in need, unknowingly saving the mother of a man named Kael, and in doing so, had set a new and unexpected path for her own life into motion. The following days passed with their usual, predictable rhythm for Elara. She went to her classes, she lost herself in the pages of her library books, and she helped her neighbor carry in his groceries. Yet, her mind kept drifting back to the park, to the frightened eyes of Mrs. Agatha and the sudden, cowardly flight of the thugs. The memory was a sharp, unsettling pebble in the smooth stream of her ordinary life. The promise of tea, however, was a warm and persistent counterpart. It felt impolite, somehow, to ignore such a sincere invitation from an elderly woman who had clearly been so shaken. So, on a Thursday afternoon when the sky was a soft, pale gray, Elara found herself walking back toward the quiet street of grand brownstone houses, a small box of lemon pastries from a local bakery held carefully in her hands. She stood on the stoop of the impressive building, her finger hesitating for a moment before she pressed the polished brass doorbell. The sound echoed faintly from within, a sonorous chime that spoke of solidity and age. The door was opened not by a servant, as some part of her had vaguely imagined, but by Mrs. Agatha herself, her face breaking into a radiant smile the moment she saw Elara. "My dear, you came," she exclaimed, her voice full of genuine delight. She ushered Elara inside, taking her light jacket and exclaiming over the thoughtful gift of pastries. "You shouldn't have, but how wonderful. We'll have them with our tea. Come in, get comfortable." Elara stepped into a home that felt like a warm, lived-in hug. The entrance hall opened into a large, comfortable sitting room that was a stark contrast to the building's formal exterior. It was filled with soft, worn armchairs, shelves overflowing with books, and countless framed photographs. A large, tabby cat slept peacefully on a sun-drenched corner of a well-loved Persian rug. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and vanilla. It was not the cold, museum-like mansion she had half expected, but a home, truly and thoroughly lived in. "This is beautiful," Elara said, her voice soft with awe as she took it all in. "It's a bit cluttered, I'm afraid," Mrs. Agatha said with a warm chuckle, leading her toward a sofa. "But it's full of happy memories. That's the real treasure in life, you know. Not the things you have, but the memories you make." She bustled about, preparing a tea tray with a delicate porcelain set painted with tiny violets. As she poured the steaming amber liquid, she asked Elara about her life, her studies, her family. Her questions were not prying, but deeply interested, and Elara found herself talking more freely than she usually did, telling stories about her parents and her dream of one day becoming a teacher. They spoke for a long time, the afternoon light slowly deepening outside the large bay window. Elara learned that Mrs. Agatha's husband had passed away many years ago, and that her son was a very busy man who traveled often for his work in the import-export business. "He worries about me too much," Mrs. Agatha said, stirring a spoonful of honey into her tea. "He's always telling me to be careful, to not talk to strangers. But I told him, I said, Kael, if I hadn't been talking to a stranger, I might not be here right now." She gave Elara a significant, grateful look. "He was very moved by what you did." Elara felt a blush creep into her cheeks. "It was really nothing, Mrs. Agatha. I just did what felt right." "That's the mark of a good character, my dear," Mrs. Agatha replied, "doing the right thing when it would be easier not to." She was just about to offer Elara another pastry when the distinct, heavy sound of a key turning in the front door's lock made them both look up. Mrs. Agatha's face lit up. "Oh, that must be him now. He wasn't supposed to be back until tonight. What a wonderful surprise." Elara felt a sudden, inexplicable flutter of nervousness. She set her teacup down carefully on its saucer, the delicate china clinking softly. The footsteps that approached down the hall were not the light, quick steps of a delivery man or a casual visitor. They were measured, solid, and heavy, each footfall a pronouncement of presence and authority. A moment later, a man filled the doorway. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his dark, impeccably tailored coat. His hair was dark and neatly styled, and his face was all sharp, serious angles, from the line of his jaw to the set of his mouth. He was younger than Elara had imagined, perhaps in his early 30s, but he carried an air of gravity that made him seem older. This was not just a busy businessman. This was a man who was used to being in command. His eyes, a cool, piercing gray, swept the room and instantly landed on her. For a fleeting second, Elara saw a flash of something dangerous and assessing in his gaze, a predator's instinct, before it was masked by a polite, questioning neutrality. "Kael, my dear," Mrs. Agatha said, rising and going to him, giving him a kiss on the cheek. "You're home early. This is the young lady I was telling you about. This is Elara." The man's, Kael's, entire demeanor transformed. The sharp, guarded expression melted away, replaced by a look of such profound and stunned gratitude that it seemed to change the very air in the room. His intense gaze shifted from Elara to his mother and back again, and for a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. "You," he began, his voice much softer and deeper than she had expected. He took a step further into the room, his focus entirely on Elara now. "You are the one who helped my mother in the park." Elara, feeling suddenly very small and very young under the weight of his attention, simply nodded. "Yes. I was just walking by." Kael looked at his mother, a complex storm of emotions in his eyes, relief, a flicker of anger at the danger she had been in, and a deep, overwhelming thankfulness. He turned back to Elara, and to her astonishment, he gave a slight, formal bow of his head. It was an old-fashioned, deeply respectful gesture that felt both out of place and utterly sincere. "Then I am in your debt," he said, his voice low and serious, each word chosen with care. "A debt I can never fully repay. My mother is my entire world. What you did—" He paused, as if searching for the right words in a language he rarely used for expressing emotion. "It was an act of incredible courage. Thank you." The sheer intensity of his gratitude was overwhelming. Elara stammered, "Really, it was nothing. Anyone would have done the same." A shadow of something bitter, something knowing, passed over Kael's features. "No," he said, and the word was final, absolute. "No, they would not have." He looked at her properly then, not as a problem or a stranger, but as a person. He seemed to really see her, her simple clothes, her kind eyes, the slight nervousness in her posture. "You have a strength that is very rare," he added, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. "To step into danger for a stranger, that is not nothing." He stayed for a little while longer, asking her a few quiet questions about herself, his intense gaze never leaving her face. He was polite, but there was a power radiating from him that made the cozy room feel suddenly smaller. When he excused himself to take a business call, the room seemed to let out a breath it had been holding. Elara's own heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had come for a simple thank you, but she had received something far more profound and unsettling. She had seen the fearsome, powerful man known as Kael, and in that moment, she had also seen the devoted son. And she had no idea that her simple act in the park had just placed her squarely in the center of his fiercely protected world. The world, for Elara, had taken on a subtle but undeniable new texture. It was like a familiar room where a single, important piece of furniture had been moved just an inch. Everything looked the same, but the feeling was profoundly different. In the days and weeks that followed her afternoon tea, she became aware of a quiet, invisible net of safety that had been cast around her life. It manifested in small, inexplicable ways. The landlord who had been persistently rude about a late rent payment suddenly became apologetic and accommodating. A gang of teenagers who sometimes loitered menacingly near her bus stop were no longer there, replaced by an almost comically serious man in a neat suit reading a newspaper on the bench each morning. When she lost her wallet on the way to class, it was returned to her doorstep not by the police, but by a polite, unsmiling courier, every last coin and card perfectly intact. These were not the random strokes of good luck she tried to convince herself they were. They were coordinated, deliberate, and quietly overwhelming. The source was not a mystery. It was the intense, gray-eyed gaze of Kael, a man whose gratitude felt less like a gift and more like a force of nature she had accidentally unleashed. Her feelings were a tangled knot. There was a layer of unease, a natural fear of such immense and unknown power being wielded over the minutiae of her existence. Who was he, really, that he could command such things with a mere word? Yet, woven through that fear was a stubborn thread of something else, something warmer and more complicated. His protection, however intimidating in its scope, was born from a place of profound goodness, his love for his mother. She had seen that love naked and raw in his eyes when he thanked her. It was a sentiment she understood deeply, a language her own heart spoke. This contradiction, the feared Mafia boss and the devoted son, refused to reconcile in her mind, creating a confusing pull that both repelled and fascinated her. The confrontation, when it came, was inevitable. It happened on a rain-slicked evening as she was walking home from the library, her backpack heavy with books. A car, sleek and dark and silent, pulled up beside her, its windows sliding down smoothly. Her heart leaped into her throat, a primal fear surging through her. But the face that looked out at her was not one of the thugs from the park. It was Kael. "Get in, please, Elara," he said, his voice calm but leaving no room for refusal. "It's not safe for you to be walking alone at this hour." Trembling, her mind racing with 1,000 fears and a strange, defiant curiosity, she opened the door and slid into the luxurious leather seat. The car interior was silent, smelling of clean leather and cold night air. He didn't drive off immediately, instead turning to look at her, his face illuminated by the soft dashboard lights. "You're wondering what is happening," he stated, not asked. "Yes," Elara whispered, her voice small. "The wallet, the man at the bus stop, it's you, isn't it?" "It is," he admitted without a hint of shame. "The men who threatened my mother, they are part of a larger, more dangerous group. They are angry, and they now know who you are." He said it so matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather, and the chill that ran down her spine had nothing to do with the rain outside. "They tried to approach you last week. They thought to scare you, to retaliate against me through you. My men discouraged them." Elara stared at him, the reality of the danger crashing down upon her. She had been a target and hadn't even known it. The fear was immediate and icy. But then she looked at his hands, resting on the steering wheel. They were strong, capable hands, but they were not clenched in anger. They were still. And his eyes, when she finally found the courage to meet them, were not filled with the cold fury she expected. They were filled with a solemn, heavy responsibility. He wasn't boasting about his power. He was stating a grim fact and accepting the burden of it. "Why?" she finally managed to ask. "Why go to all this trouble for me? You already thanked me." A long silence filled the car. "Because a simple thank you is not enough," he said, his voice low and intense. "You acted with a selfless courage that is absent from my world. In my world, every action has a price. Every kindness is a transaction. You asked for nothing. You expected nothing." He looked away, out at the rain-streaked window, at the dark, ordinary street she called home. "Protecting you is not a transaction for me. It is a necessity." He began to drive then, not to her home, but through the quiet, glistening streets of the city. And as he drove, he began to talk. He didn't talk about his work, the dark business that gave him his power. He spoke of his childhood, of a father who was taken from them too soon, of the weight of having to become strong too quickly to protect his mother and the family business he inherited. He spoke of the constant, grinding vigilance, of the loneliness that came from a position where trust was a luxury he could seldom afford. He spoke not as a fearsome boss, but as a man. A tired, lonely man who had built walls around himself so high he had forgotten what the world looked like from the outside. Elara listened, her fear slowly melting away, replaced by a dawning, profound understanding. The monster she had feared was just a man, shaped by a life of harsh necessities. The kindness he was showing her was the one pure thing he could offer, the one part of his life that was not tainted by shadows and violence. He was, in his own terrifying way, trying to be good. By the time he pulled up in front of her apartment building, the rain had stopped. The silence between them was no longer tense, but contemplative, filled with the echoes of his unexpected confession. "Thank you," Elara said softly, before she got out, "for telling me, and for keeping me safe." Kael simply nodded, that same formal, slight dip of his head. But this time, his eyes held a new, unreadable emotion. "You will always be safe, Elara. You have my word." As she walked to her door, she didn't look back, but she could feel his gaze on her until she was inside. The invisible net was still there, but it no longer felt like a cage. It felt, strangely, like a promise. And the confusing pull she felt toward the man in the dark car was no longer just fear or gratitude. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous, and far more beautiful, a connection. The fragile understanding that had blossomed in the quiet of the rain-slicked car began to grow in the weeks that followed, nurtured by cautious encounters and carefully chosen words. Kael did not overwhelm her, but his presence in her life became a constant, steady rhythm. Sometimes, he would be waiting in his car outside her classes, offering a quiet ride home. Other times, he would appear at the little cafe she liked, coincidentally having business nearby, and they would share a pot of tea. Their conversations were a delicate dance. He asked about her books, her dreams of teaching, her simple, honest view of the world. She, in turn, asked him about his childhood, his mother, the weight of his responsibilities. He never spoke of the violence, of the dark mechanics of his power, but he spoke of its cost, the sleepless nights, the constant vigilance, the profound isolation. Elara saw the men behind the legend, the boy who had to become a fortress to protect what he loved. She saw the weariness in his eyes and the rare, genuine smile that appeared when she told a silly story about one of her students. Her initial fear was being steadily, irrevocably replaced by a deep and aching compassion, and something else, something warmer and more terrifying that she dared not name. This new, tender connection, however, did not go unnoticed. In the shadowy underworld that Kael commanded, every move he made was watched, analyzed, and exploited. His enemies, a rival faction led by a ruthless and ambitious man named Rorik, saw the change in him. They saw his distracted air, the uncharacteristic softness in his demeanor. They learned of the girl, the ordinary girl who walked to the library and drank tea with his mother. To Rorik, Elara was not a person. She was a key. She was the one, glaring vulnerability in Kael's otherwise impenetrable armor, a crack through which they could strike a mortal blow. While Kael was building a fragile bridge to a world of light, Rorik was plotting to use that bridge to burn his entire kingdom to the ground. The trap was set on a day that felt deceptively peaceful. Elara was walking home, her mind preoccupied with a lesson plan and the memory of Kael's laughter from their last conversation. She was so wrapped in her own thoughts that she didn't notice the van until it was too late. It slid to a halt beside her, its side door sliding open with a harsh, metallic sound. Before a scream could even form in her throat, strong, rough hands grabbed her, yanking her off her feet and into the dark, stifling interior. A cloth, smelling sickly sweet, was clamped over her nose and mouth. The world swam, her struggles grew weak, and then everything went black. When she awoke, it was to the smell of damp concrete and stale oil. She was in a chair, her wrists and ankles bound tightly with coarse rope. The room was a windowless, abandoned warehouse, vast and echoing, lit by a single, bare bulb hanging from a high, rusted beam. Fear, cold and absolute, gripped her heart, squeezing the air from her lungs. Meanwhile, Kael had known the moment she was taken. The men who had been discreetly watching her apartment had reported her failure to arrive. The message from Rorik arrived minutes later, a single, taunting text with a grainy photo of Elara, unconscious in the chair. It was a declaration of war, and it targeted the one thing Kael truly valued. The calm, controlled businessman vanished. In his place was something primal, a storm of pure, unadulterated fury. His office, usually a place of quiet calculation, became a war room. Maps were spread, phones were slammed down, orders were barked in a voice that was low and deadly. This was not a business negotiation. This was a rescue mission, and the cost of failure was unthinkable. The assault on the warehouse was not a stealthy infiltration. It was a thunderclap. Kael and his most trusted men descended upon the location with a ferocity that stunned Rorik's guards. The silence of the industrial district was shattered by the roar of engines, the splintering of doors, and the sharp, percussive sounds of a brutal, close-quarters fight. Kael moved through the chaos like an avenging angel, his focus absolute, his expression a mask of cold, focused rage. He was not just reclaiming a hostage, he was erasing the very idea that someone could touch what was his. He found her in the large, open space, where Rorik stood, a knife held to Elara's throat. The moon was sneering, spitting threats and demands, but Kael's eyes were only on Elara. He saw the terror in her wide eyes, the tear tracks on her dusty cheeks, the raw, red marks on her wrists from the ropes. In that moment, every pretense, every carefully maintained wall between his two worlds, crumbled to dust. The revelation was as stark and undeniable as the gun in his hand. "Let her go, Rorik." Kael's voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "This is between you and me. She has no part in it." The ensuing confrontation was a blur of violent motion. A shot rang out, then another. Kael moved with a speed that defied reason, closing the distance, his only goal to place himself between Elara and any danger. When the final, echoing gunshot faded, Rorik lay on the ground, and Kael was cutting Elara's bonds with a knife pulled from his boot, his hands, for the first time, trembling. He knelt before her, the fearsome Mafia boss brought to his knees not by an enemy, but by fear for her. "Elara," he breathed, his voice ragged, his hands gently cupping her face, checking for injuries. "Did they hurt you? Look at me. Are you hurt?" Elara could only shake her head, sobs of relief and shock racking her body. She was staring at him, not at the violence around them, but at the raw, terrified love blazing in his eyes. He wasn't hiding it anymore. In that moment of ultimate peril, He had shown his entire hand. He had torn his world apart to get to her, and the look on his face was not one of simple gratitude or obligation. It was a confession, more powerful than any words. As he gathered her into his arms, carrying her out of the darkness and into the clean night air, Elara buried her face in his shoulder. The fear was still there, a cold tremor in her bones. But wrapped around it, stronger and more enduring, was the stunning, undeniable truth of what he had just done. He had stormed his own personal hell to save her, and in doing so, had shown her the one thing he had kept hidden from the world, his heart. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep into her soul, that she was irrevocably, dangerously in love with him. The world outside the warehouse was a blur of rushing wind and the silent, urgent speed of the car. Wrapped in Kael's jacket, its fabric still carrying the faint, clean scent of him mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder, Elara trembled not from the cold night air, but from the seismic shift that had just occurred within the very foundation of her soul. He held her close, one arm secured around her shoulders, his other hand gripping the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity. He didn't speak. There were no empty words of comfort, no attempts to explain or justify the violence they had just escaped. The silence between them was thick and heavy, filled with the unspoken confession that had blazed in his eyes in that dusty, terrifying room. He had laid his heart bare, and the truth of it was both terrifying and utterly captivating. She leaned into his solid strength, her ear pressed against his chest, listening to the frantic, slowing rhythm of his heart, a heart that had beaten with a fear not for his own life, but for hers. He didn't take her to her small, vulnerable apartment. That part of her life, the simple, independent existence she had known, felt like a distant memory from another lifetime. Instead, he drove to his own home, a severe and beautiful modern structure perched on a cliff overlooking the sleeping city. It was a fortress, all clean lines and silent, guarded spaces, but he carried her over the threshold not as a prisoner, but as something precious to be protected. He didn't summon servants or guards. He tended to her himself, with a tenderness that made her throat ache. He brought a warm, damp cloth and gently wiped the grime and tears from her face, his touch impossibly soft. He examined the raw rope burns on her wrists, his jaw tightening, a flicker of the earlier storm returning to his eyes before he carefully applied a soothing salve. He made her a cup of sweet, hot tea. His large, capable hands that had just wielded such devastating violence, curling around the delicate china cup with surprising grace as he handed it to her. For 3 days, she stayed within the serene walls of his home. It was a time of quiet recovery and profound realizations. Mrs. Agatha came, her kind eyes filled with a knowing sorrow, and she held Elara's hands and spoke not of the danger, but of her son. She spoke of the goodman buried beneath the weight of his legacy, the boy who had loved poetry and who had wanted to be an architect, the son who had shouldered a terrible burden to keep her safe, and the family's many employees provided for. Kael, meanwhile, was different. The imposing, guarded boss was gone. In his place was a man who was simply, openly, devoted. He was constantly near, a quiet, watchful presence. He didn't press her for answers or declarations. He simply was there, reading in a chair across the room while she rested, his presence a steady anchor in her turbulent emotions. They walked in his walled garden, and he told her, in a low, earnest voice, about his father's dream for the family business, a legitimate, respectable enterprise, and how that dream had been corrupted by the harsh realities of the world. He spoke of his own dream, one he had long thought impossible, to untangle himself from the violent roots of his power, to build something clean, something he could be proud of, something that would not cast a shadow over anyone he loved. Tea was on the evening of the 3rd day, as they stood on the terrace watching the city lights twinkle like a field of stars below, that Elara knew her choice was made. The fear was still there, a small, cold stone in her stomach. She was not naive. She knew the path with him would be difficult, fraught with challenges and dangers she could scarcely imagine. It would mean giving up the ordinary life she had always planned for herself. But as she looked at his profile silhouetted against the night sky, at the quiet resolve and the hidden vulnerability in his posture, she understood that walking away would be a far greater loss. A life without his fierce protection, without his unexpected gentleness, without the profound connection that had grown between them in the midst of chaos, would be a life only half-lived. Her love for him was not a simple, easy emotion. It was a choice, a conscious, brave decision to accept the whole, complicated man, the devoted son, the fearsome boss, and the dreamer who wanted to be more. She turned to him, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a calm, steady certainty. "Kael," she said, her voice clear in the quiet night. He turned immediately, his gray eyes searching her face, a lifetime of guarded hope shining in their depths. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. For a long moment, he was perfectly still, as if her words were a fragile thing he was afraid to break. Then, the control he held so tightly finally, completely, shattered. He closed the small distance between them and pulled her into his arms, not with the desperate strength of the rescue, but with a deep, reverent passion that stole her breath. He kissed her, and it was a promise, a surrender, and a new beginning all at once. It was the kiss of a man who had found his way out of the darkness, and of the woman who had unknowingly been his beacon all along. In the months that followed, the city began to change in subtle ways. Kael's organization, once a name spoken only in fearful whispers, began a slow, deliberate transformation. Certain brutal practices were ended. Illicit businesses were sold or dismantled. The import-export company his father had founded began to thrive in the legitimate world, creating jobs and opportunities. It was not an easy path. There was resistance from within and threats from rivals who saw his change as a weakness. But Kael faced it all with a new, unshakable purpose. He was no longer fighting just to maintain power. He was building a future worthy of the woman who had believed in the good man he could be. Elara, by his side, was his strength and his conscience. She brought light into his shadowed world, not by changing him, but by loving the parts of him that were truly worth loving. Theirs was not a fairy tale romance, neat and without trouble. It was a partnership, a deep and abiding love forged in difficulty and tempered by unwavering loyalty. It was the story of an unknowing kindness that had saved a man's soul, and in doing so, had written a new, brighter chapter for them both, a chapter that was only just beginning. If you enjoyed following Elara and Kael's journey from a chance meeting to a powerful love that changed their world, and you want to discover more stories where courage meets unexpected romance and ordinary lives collide with extraordinary destinies, then make sure to subscribe for more. New tales of heart, hope, and gripping drama are waiting to be shared, and you won't want to miss a single one. Subscribe now and join us for the next adventure.